This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. My name is Philip Murphy, I'm Director here. It's an enormous pleasure to be able to host the launch of Sir Don McKinnon's memoir, In the Ring. I'd like to begin by thanking Lorne Forsyth and his colleagues from Elliott and Thompson for setting this up and for sponsoring the reception after our panel session. And I should say, before I forget, and I'll say it at the end again, copies are available on sale in the foyer if you don't happen to have one yet. It's an excellent read, so do get hold of one. As I say, it's wonderful to have with us the former Commonwealth Secretary General, Sir Don McKinnon. Don's a distinguished politician who served for 9 years as New Zealand's Foreign Minister, combining that between 1990 and 1996 with the post of Deputy Prime Minister. At the Durban Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 1999, he was elected as the fourth Secretary General of the Commonwealth. It was a post that he filled with great distinction until 2008. During a turbulent period in global affairs, which witnessed 9/11 and the Iraq War, the Commonwealth itself, of course, found itself embroiled in the affairs of Zimbabwe, Pakistan, and Fiji, to mention just three of its most difficult customers. Don has remained actively involved in Commonwealth affairs, most recently as the Secretary-General's Special Envoy to the Maldives. As well as his many other achievements, Sir Don McKinnon began his working life on a 3,500-acre sheep farm. I'm happy to be corrected on this because I know there's so much expertise in this room, can claim to be the only Commonwealth Secretary-General who, as he notes in his memoir, could produce a respectable sheep carcass of near supermarket quality. I leave it to you to judge whether the early experience of herding sheep is good experience for a career in international politics. I leave that hanging in the air. It's also an enormous pleasure to have on the panel the journalist and author Peter Oborne, one of the most entertaining commentators on contemporary politics, and someone whose courage and wit and independence of mind have won him admirers from right across the political spectrum. His 2007 study, The Triumph of the Political Class, would be towards the top of any reading list I would produce for newcomers to the UK who wanted to understand our political formation over the last decade or so. He's written biographies of Alistair Campbell and the cricketer Basil D'Oliveira, and I leave it up to you to guess which one he admires the most. And he's been highly critical of the international community's failure to take a stronger line against the regime of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear what Don has to say and to comment on the long section in Don's book dealing with the crisis in Zimbabwe. So what we're going to do is Don is going to say a few words, Peter will respond, I'll say a few words, and then we'll open it up to the floor before we break for a reception. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Sir Don McKinnon.
Thank you very much, Philip, and I'm one of those sort of, when you're a politician, it's very hard to speak sitting down. You don't feel as though you're speaking properly at all. So I will stand, even if though when we get to Q&As I may remain a bit seated. But thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for the opportunity of meeting a number of people, and there's still a number of friendly faces in the audience that I can see here. I haven't seen them for a few years. And already just that has prompted me to think about a few things that probably should have gone into the book anyway, but didn't go into the book. But I was always taken by the comment of the first Commonwealth Secretary General, Arthur Smith, a Canadian diplomat, who said, in effect, I think his words were, the Commonwealth works far better than it can ever be defined. And I think that's very much at the centre of where we often run into problems. When people say, well, what does it represent? What does it do? How does it do good things? Whatever. And as soon as you start to define the Commonwealth, you start to sort of go out sideways. And I often say to people, just look at what it does rather than try and explain what it does is much easier. It is rather remarkable that the organisation has hung together as long as it has. It's, I think more obituaries have been written about the Commonwealth than any other organisation. And I venture to say in 50 years' time, they'll still be writing obituaries about the Commonwealth. It is truly remarkable that in fact 54 countries can agree to be together on anything. And the very fact that the Commonwealth members do so, stay together, hang together, probably in preference to hanging separately, but they do get that benefit of the coalition, working together, reinforcing each other's values in many cases. I mean, the history is well known to all of you here, what really, most of it came out of an empire. Although I often found in this country, you hear, well, were you one of the colonies? When in fact, the Commonwealth was a mixture of some colonies, some dominions, some protectorates, some trusteeships. As I often say, 5 former German colonies, members of the Commonwealth. And so there's that very broad spread, even at the beginning, that has allowed this institution to get to the point where it is today. So it wasn't very difficult for me to write about it as I've done here. And when you do write about something, I guess, and I hasten on, particularly to Peter Oborne here, you know, I now admire tremendously people who make a living writing. I would not like to try and make a living writing. Clearly not my strength. But I decided that my period of time of 8 years was worth writing about. And I was prompted to do so as much as anything, or I was sort of forced into it when someone said, well, if you don't write about your 8 years in the Commonwealth, someone else will, and you won't like what they say. Well, that was enough for my competitive spirit to rise and say, all right, I'm going to damn well start writing. And then, of course, in the world of politics, you get up to talk, and you're immediately, who am I talking to? Who is my audience? Who am I directing my message to? And I decided I really was competing when writing about the Commonwealth, mostly academic people. And most writings about the Commonwealth are from academic people. I am not an academic, haven't aspired to be an academic, but I decided I was just writing to people that I would meet on a daily basis. People that might have had an interest in the Commonwealth or mildly interested in the Commonwealth, not particularly interested in international relations, but would be fascinated by some of the things that goes on in international relations. So my target audience was just a broad mixture of people that you would meet anywhere. And hopefully I've achieved that in one way of bringing in a lot of anecdotal material. I have done my very best to preserve a certain level of confidentiality. When it comes to the retreat of the Choggams, when leaders are there on their own, I haven't ever quoted anyone directly. Because I felt that retreat is so important, and leaders should know that whatever they say there. I have referred to things generally, or rather than speak of a leader, might refer to someone as a South Asian leader or a Pacific leader, but merely to accentuate the point of the argument that was being raised. You know, why did that particular person get involved in that particular issue? The one, I don't want to take up a lot of time trying to relitigate the issues I've raised in my book tonight, obviously, and I'm very interested to hear what Peter has to say now. He and I met the other night, and I've never seen so many annotations written by hand in my book that he's been scribbling through his copy, so he's got it well sorted out in his mind. But I think the thoughts that I'd like to leave an audience like this is, do the Commonwealth membership. Do members of the Commonwealth make the most of their Commonwealth membership? And I would say, from my experience of 8 years, no, they do not. Some do. The average ones, a little bit of this and that, and some can probably ignore it totally. So I would, and I would often say to leaders, you know, are you really taking advantage of your membership of the Commonwealth? Are you really using it to extend your external relationships? Are you using it as a source of 54 votes that you might wish to have support you for some other enterprise? And that's where I find that you can cajole leaders or cajole governments into doing that much more. When leaders do have to look at such things as their membership of the Commonwealth, they should also put it alongside their membership of other organisations. Now, in my part of the world, in my country, New Zealand, yes, we belong to the Commonwealth, we belong to APEC, we belong to the ASEAN Post-Ministerial Conference, we belong to the Pacific Forum. And one would hope that even within all countries, you look at your memberships of external organisations, and you should do an audit of all of them on a regular basis. Are we getting the most from our membership of this organisation? I think it was the government of Vanuatu one time who complained to me they couldn't pay their dues to the Commonwealth because they didn't have enough money and they were paying dues to about 100 organisations. And that prompted me to get some people to have a look at this issue, which we did. And we developed a template whereby any government could put this template across an international organisation where you would tick the boxes or cross the boxes and decide whether this organisation was giving you what you believed you were getting. And if it wasn't, you really should decide whether you should stay a member. So it's not just a question of being a member of an organisation like the Commonwealth and saying, well, isn't this a wonderful thing? Yes, we all adhere to these values. As an individual country, you really should audit it once a year and decide for yourself why you should stay there, and if not, what should you do about it? And that's just some of the thoughts that I'd like to leave with you tonight before we sort of go into the broader issue of where this whole organisation is going anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I must say, we better, speaking as a chief political commentator of the Daily Telegraph, I'd like to see that template. Fly up to the European Union. Now, so I might be touching you up afterwards, but you can slip me that. I've read your book, Sir Don, and it's a wonderful book, actually. And I thought I just might explain for a few minutes why I think it's such a wonderful book. I don't think, I support the Commonwealth and greatly value it, but I didn't really understand the purpose of it, or what happened, or exactly how it worked. And what you get from Don's book is a sense of what it is. And it's something which is, the biggest sense, of course, you get is that it's a family. And this is very unique and extraordinary. The second thing, of course, is the great importance of the Queen in this. And Don writes beautifully about the Queen, and how she is at the heart of it. And the third thing, I think, is its utility in international affairs. Now, Don isn't indiscreet, but what he does do is he explains his long relationships with the various embattled
countries around the world, you know, his long relationship with Mugabe, with Sharaf and so forth. And they're very interesting. It's just keeping the dialogue going, is what you say in this book, is that it's not about confrontation, it's about staying at the table. It's very, you know, it's not something that's going to produce great outcomes immediately, but something which is, you can tell, reading the book, it is not nonetheless extraordinarily valuable and important. And by the way, I think you're wrong now about Zimbabwe. I think it's time to start wondering whether we bring it back in. I think that, interesting, even with Mugabe there, I think interesting, and David Banks was telling me about a conversation he had with somebody very senior in the MDC yesterday, in which he was saying how hopeful we've all suddenly become about what's going on in Zimbabwe and whether isn't it time to invite Mr. Mugabe back again. I felt that you, I loved your book, but there's one area I wondered whether it wasn't time to start rethinking some issues. But it's not the. It's not just that, it's the small things. You were beautiful about, for instance, this primary school curriculum in Ghana, that you reworked that, you started, and after 2 or 3 years you're seeing children emerge much more confident and all of I got a real sense, reading your book, of the enormous value of this institution. I also got a sense, and I'm going to flash you, I thought you were obviously marvellously good at it, actually, I could tell that. And is it true you spent 30% of your life in an aeroplane? Because he lives in New Zealand, of course, and he's always going off to any journeys that take him a day. The second thing I got out of this book is not so cheerful, actually. Was I got a strong sense that many Commonwealth countries really loved and appreciated being in the Commonwealth, understood what it was, but the one thing I got, apart from Britain, that was the, I mean, basically, you were there between 2000 and 2008, which was the height of the New Labour ascendancy. And the lack of care taken by the British government during your period is really very shocking, and I found very shameful. You told one example of at a crisis Commonwealth meeting, 6 ministers, Commonwealth ministers have come to London, and the Foreign Office can't even be bothered to send a minister to walk across St James's Park to talk to them. I mean, it's really awful. And I'm not going to be, you were very discreet in your book, but you weren't always very discreet. And I was delighted, because I've come across this character myself in my professional career, in relation to the Iraq War. It's a character called Sir Michael, now Lord J. And he was permanent secretary of the Foreign Office, as he would think of it. And his conduct in connection with the Iraq War, in that he allowed the Foreign Office to be completely ignored. This is what I saw when I was reporting this. He allowed foreign policy to be made from Downing Street. He rigorously cut off the people in the Foreign Office who knew anything about Iraq or anywhere near it, and just allowed the David Manning in the Foreign Office and Tony Blair to form a little group which assembled British foreign policy, along with a couple of rather undistinguished people in SIS. I then read the other side of what this man, Jay, was up to at the same time, and his failure to understand what the Commonwealth was for, his failure to send this snub to these ministers, the endlessly repeated failure to mention the Commonwealth in the Foreign Office annual report to Parliament, failure to mention the Commonwealth and eventually, Sir Don, I'm delighted to say, came down on this wretched creature very hard indeed. You give an account of how you explained to him that Britain's reputation is at stake. It's got to pay attention to the Commonwealth. I was cheering you on, Don. Keep it up. But it's a very, very serious point that the British government, the Foreign Office, or the Foreign Commonwealth Office, as it forgets it's called, has structurally failed to understand the importance. I think there is a sense, I think that William Hague has tried to make things a bit better. David Howe in particular, Lord Howe, who's a very good thing, he was appointed, indeed, Minister for the Commonwealth. And we were talking about, I asked, when I saw Don Langforth last, I said to him, what do you think of Howe? He said, oh, very good man, it's very good he's a member of government, it means that we now have somebody who understands the Commonwealth. I was obliged to inform him, of course, that Howe was sacked in the reshuffle last autumn. And that was a manifestation of how the Cameron government has lost the plot as well. But I thought it was a wonderful book. I learnt so much from it, and thank you for writing it, I think.
I should just say, I was just thinking about this for some reason while Peter was speaking. There is a camera on. We often record these things. But if people think we'd have more fun under Chatham House rules, we can always just wipe the tape at the end. So just wondering whether Michael James
the Watergate on there.
So let's see how we get on. It's interesting that when we do these things, the panelists don't confer in advance, and often we come up with very different takes on the book that we've been discussing. It's interesting how Peter and I have been thinking along very much the same lines, although perhaps with a slightly different slant on some of these things. I should also say what a pleasure it was to read this. Genuinely, I don't often find that with books about the Commonwealth. It avoids two of the major pitfalls, I think, that people often fall into, particularly people, I may say not academics, but people from close to the organisation sometimes fall into when writing about the Commonwealth. The first is the use of the kind of standard cliches about the Commonwealth that we've heard so many times before. The second, I think, is to become obsessed by process. I mean, for an organisation that claims to represent 2 billion people, the Commonwealth can sometimes seem rather parochial and inward-looking. It's got its own private language of Choggans and CMAGs and Coolum and what have you. And there sometimes seems to be an assumption that if you can get your particular pet issue onto a communique somewhere, you've achieved something remarkable. And what's so lovely and what's so refreshing about In the Ring is that it's an unvarnished and unsentimental account by an experienced politician who knows the difference between a practical achievement and an attractive passage in a glossy brochure. It really cuts to the chase. And I think in doing so, actually, is a better advertisement for the Commonwealth than a lot of glossy brochures. It makes you feel that this is something that was worth doing. And again, I think Peter was hinting at this. It's a very humane book. The focus is on people rather than committees. And on the whole, the judgments are generous ones. There are very few out-and-out villains in this book. I was trying to think of any. I think probably the only one I could think of was Sonia Batcher.
Michael J.
Oh, and Michael J. But I don't we'll follow that line of thought. And I doubt whether Robert Mugabe would relish the description of him in Don's book. But actually, Don gives a remarkably balanced account, I think, of the Zimbabwe crisis, from which neither the British government nor one particular British Foreign Secretary emerged with very much credit. I think there's an admirable tendency here to understand as well as to condemn figures like Musharraf, who found themselves at the sharp end of the Commonwealth's attempts to enforce their shared values. And again, picking up on what Peter said, I think the key message is the need to keep lines of communication open, to keep on talking. We often talk about Commonwealth values rather than virtues, but if there is a Commonwealth virtue, it's clearly the virtue of patience. At the same time, the book provides significant evidence for some of the Commonwealth's weaknesses. And the most obvious, I suppose, is the lack of buy-in from major states. I mean, Peter mentioned Britain as being the kind of the exception to the rule. I'm not sure that it is, and I'm not sure that the book really suggests it is. There's a lot of evidence for the way in which the old dominions, if you like, the developed countries of the Commonwealth, still seem to operate as a bloc. And they are, as Don says, the major contributors to the Commonwealth's budget, and by far the largest contributors to its aid programme. And yet Don mentions lack of ministerial interest in Canada at some point. Of course, the juiciest passages are about the British government. There's a lovely line about Tony Blair. I think he put Commonwealth in the same category as fox hunting. It belonged to another age. It wasn't New Labour. And Don, I think, very interestingly says that Blair wasn't impressed by what he saw in the Edinburgh Chogham shortly after taking office. And indeed, Alistair Campbell's diaries more than bear that out. Gordon Brown is mentioned as being ill-informed on the Commonwealth matters. Ditto David Miliband, and of course our friend Sir Michael Jay, who's described as, Don says he never had the feeling that Michael Jay was a committed Commonwealth man. But, of course, there's also India, by far the largest Commonwealth state. And Don talks about how, from as early as the 1960s, the non-aligned movement came far higher up on India's agenda than the Commonwealth, and India wasn't represented at Commonwealth summits at a head of government level. He talks about how quite many Indian officials still deemed the Commonwealth to be the B team, preferring the A team action on the East River in Midtown Manhattan. And he mentions at one point his disappointment with frustration with Thabo Mbeki over his engagements with Zimbabwe. So I think it's more than just Great Britain, and that should be worrying from a Commonwealth perspective, that some of the biggest hitters don't give the Commonwealth their full support. Of course, one of its big supporters is the Palace, and to my utter frustration, just a few days before I got this book, I'd submitted my manuscript on the Queen and the Commonwealth to OUP, and I had to claw it back and rewrite various passages, particularly over the question of the succession, which Don goes into. I mean, it is the elephant in the room, and Don identifies it and says some very interesting things indeed about it. But of course, if the Queen, as we know, is a great supporter, her son maybe not so much. Don says that Charles seemed to keep his distance from the Commonwealth, and I decided we had to pull him closer into the fold. It may be interesting to hear a little bit more about that. I just say sort of finally, I mean, I'm haunted by this passage about Blair in the first Chogham in Edinburgh, because it reminds me of going to the Chogham Perth, the Perth Chogham in 2011, and seeing David Cameron sitting on that stage during that interminable opening ceremony, and looking at him and thinking, is that a man who thinks he's making good use of his time? And I had to conclude that it was not. And I think it's perhaps easy to complain that member states don't take the Commonwealth seriously. Perhaps the onus is sometimes on the Commonwealth Secretariat to prove to ministers, to prove to those who have power within the Commonwealth, that they do need to take it seriously because it can achieve significant things. And Don's book is important evidence of this. It's an important historical document, and I'm extremely pleased that he's read it, and I commend it to you today. Before I open the floor, would you like to respond to anything Peter and I have said, or should we
take a long time.
Okay.
No, look, you've covered the field, and it's always difficult to get the balance. You know, you can a sentence comment about a particular individual can maybe it was designed to be a light-hearted comment. It could be seen to be much heavier in other circumstances. So, you know, you're never going to get it quite right, but I'm not losing any sleep on that at all, so I don't worry too much about it. I can say that I don't know whether it was our involvement of pulling the Prince of Wales, and we did spend quite a lot of time getting him involved in a number of functions, but he and his good lady, Camilla, the Duchess, were in New Zealand only a couple of months ago, and it was a remarkably successful tour, which I would not have thought would have been possible 3 or 4 years before. But clearly here was a man now who was a much happier man in his personal life and thoroughly enjoying what he was doing on behalf of the Queen for the Diamond Jubilee, and by all accounts he had an extraordinarily successful tour in Australia. Now, what that meant, that pendulum that swings over us in that part of the world between republicanism and the monarchy just started to swing back again towards the monarchy. That's the sort of thing that can happen if the right relationships are there. So, but of course that is 4 years since I left office, so things have happened in that time.
Thank you very much. Let's open up the floor. Can I ask, as usual, if you could keep your questions relatively brief and just identify yourselves before asking a question. And I make the standard reminder that those lovely microphones in front of you are purely ornamental. But you'll have to project your voice. Please, yeah, Rita.
I'm the president of the Commonwealth Journalists Association. I just wonder, when you look back at your tenure, is there one point or one issue that you dealt with that you think you would have done differently?
The one point that I do remember is that when I finished, every journalist asked me, what was the one point you remember? What was the best thing you did? What was the worst thing you did?
Okay, the worst.
And I've never really been able to honestly answer what was, because there were so many things that we were dealing with at any one time. And to me, when you went and saw a whole bunch of smiling kids in Swaziland getting the first education they would ever get, that to me was as important as something that we've done as anything else. One of the comments we used to make was that the automobile crash that doesn't occur is never news, but you actually do stop a lot of train wrecks. But it's not news to stop a train wreck. But you know that you've done it, and the following day you can say, well, we've achieved something. It ain't a headline. It never will be a headline. So there's a whole series of things like that, Rita, that I think back on and think, well, that wasn't too bad, but there's probably no accolades on the worst thing, obviously I lost the country. The only Commonwealth Secretary General to lose a country, to lose a member country. And it was very sad the day it happened. I still distinctly remember that once the news came through that Mugabe had walked out. We did have confidence that we could sort of hold them, but that tended to, it underpinned once again that, you know, our authority was only a moral authority. And I say it only because we have no Chapter 7 UN, we have no force, we don't have arms, we don't have armies or anything like that. It's a moral authority. And there were so many issues which I described, like the fishermen. You're trying to catch a 50-pound fish on a line with a 5-pound breaking strain. You can only pull it so hard, and otherwise you lose the whole thing. So, yeah, the loss of one, that wasn't good.
Occasionally, Navaratnam, Commonwealth Vision Awards, member of the Round Table, BBC broadcaster. How do you think the international image of the Commonwealth can be improved, given the comparatively small level of coverage of Commonwealth affairs, as Peter touched on.
Well, I mean, look, it does also reflect, we have a very small budget in the Commonwealth. Remember, for every one, I quoted this morning, for every £1 the British government gives the Commonwealth, the EU gets £350. The UN gets £50, NATO gets, I think, about £20. So, you know, you can't expect an organisation with that funding base to make a huge amount of constant noise and press releases kind of thing. You do have to continue to publicise the things you do. And I always used to insist that when we started a project, wherever it was, you announce the project. The Commonwealth is doing this project. You do it halfway through the project. The Commonwealth's involved in this project. When you finish the project, but we had so many technical consultants who were doing this work in all parts of the Commonwealth, it didn't concern them to advertise this. They just went in and did their job and walked out again. And we had to sort of really be able to leap in and make something of these events. I was surprised the number of times I would go and see a Commonwealth project and everyone around me assumed it was done by someone else. I thought, if you're doing things and not getting any credit at all, you really got to do something about it. And we do have to tell people constantly of the good things we do.
Thank you. Daisy Cooper, member of the Round Table and former Comsec official under your leadership. All of your predecessors have described in one place or another how they used the office of the Secretary General in their dealings with various member states. They tried to shape or expand the role or use the office of the SG to get them to sort of elbow their way into various places and processes. I'll be very interested to hear from you about some examples of how you felt that you sort of shaped and used the role and how you used it in your dealings with member states.
I think, Daisy, I'll let other people make comments on that, but you do have to push your way in. There's no question about that. You do have to, and for a new Secretary General, you know, you've probably got a year before people take too much notice of you anyway, until you can leave yourself. And I found when I was Foreign Minister, this truly was a surprise to me, that foreign ministers probably change very little in the job. But what I found that globally, as they have been in office longer, they become more senior, they are perceived to have more wisdom, and they get noticed far more often. But in the same way that the Secretary General, you just have to make sure that people know that you're there, that you are doing things. You tell people what you're doing, and sometimes you do have to force yourself into unwelcome company. But you're doing so with the authority that's behind you, and that's the important thing. You do have that authority being the representative of 54 governments.
Please.
Ian Moore, I was in the British Diplomatic Service and had the great pleasure of being our Deputy High Commissioner in Wellington when Don was Deputy Prime Minister there. I'd like to ask about one particularly tricky issue. Now, generally I would agree with what Peter Oborne said about particularly in the Blair government, attitude towards the Commonwealth being downgraded, and sadly I think that was true. But there's one particular issue that I think you will have come across, which I think affected Britain's ability to contribute as much morally as she could, and that's the historic treatment of the Chagosians, who were removed from the islands in the British Indian Ocean, and also in some ways the treatment right back at the time of Mauritius when it was moving to independence. But do you think that that's tarnished the UK's image with other Commonwealth countries to any extent?
That particular one, I would say generally no. I thought it was a very bad decision, and I said so a number of times when I could see the British government was continuing to avoid the decision made by their own courts, and it kept on going to a higher court and a higher, and the FCO was appealing, and every court said that the Chagosian people should be allowed to go back to the Chagos Islands. And eventually, they finally got the House of Lords to agree with them, which it was a very bad decision, that one, and they should have been much more amendable. And when I took them on about it, because the British government would always hide behind, oh, the Americans want us to do this, and when I talked to the American government, they said we couldn't care less if those people came back. So, and this was the whole issue around, what's the bigger group of islands called? No, the big Diego Garcia.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, which it was clearly been used by the Americans in the Iraq War to base there. I thought you might have said when Margaret Thatcher was backing the apartheid regime in South Africa more than what she really had to against the rest of the Commonwealth. I think that did diminish the British government's role vis-a-vis the Commonwealth. I don't think there was an abrupt real change. I think it was just a kind of a drift away from the Commonwealth. I use the description of when Arnold Smith left office as the Secretary General, he was given a dinner in Downing Street. When Sonny Ramphal left office, he got a lunch in Downing Street. When my predecessor left office, he got a lunch by the Foreign Secretary. When I left office, Gordon Brown offered me a cup of tea.
Neville Linton, former Commonwealth Secretary. When you took on the job, was there any role or possibility that you anticipated having that you didn't? The way the job turned out, and the reverse. Did anything come up that you did not anticipate having to do?
I did not know a lot about the Commonwealth, the Secretariat, before I came. As a 9-year foreign minister, I was probably better prepared than coming from any other place. I think probably being a foreign minister would be the only apprenticeship you could possibly serve if you were coming as an outsider. The big challenge to me at the very beginning was the internal administration, the finances of the Secretariat, and to ensure that we got away from tagged audited accounts by our auditors. And we did succeed in that after, Sandy, what, about 3 years or 4 years? I think we finally got clean audits. But that to me was very important, because Commonwealth governments are constantly saying, are we getting value for money? And when your accounts are tagged by the auditors, how can you say that hand on heart you're getting value for money? So I think the challenge of the internal administration was significant, and implementing the rotation policy of ensuring that there was a far greater turnover of staff, to me was very important. And I found that after a couple of years of that, there was a whole new level of energy came into the place, because we had so many more new senior people coming, and all who wanted to prove themselves, all who had new ideas, innovation, enthusiasm, and that to me made a big difference to the place. But those things I wasn't expecting at all. Question?
Geoffrey Payne, I'm a urban planning and housing consultant. I owe my career to the Commonwealth, in that I was given a Commonwealth scholarship over 40 years ago. So I have a great sense of commitment to the Commonwealth personally. And I detect a large amount of support among younger professionals to follow similar international development careers. But you talk about value for money, and it seems to me that the assessment of value for money these days is much more short-term. and much more narrowly focused in terms of an accountancy view of economics. Do you see any leverage within the Commonwealth to go back to the sort of opportunities that existed when I was starting my career that can enable young professionals now to have the sort of opportunities that I had?
That's a pretty complex one, and you know, the Chinese say you never cross the same river twice, because the times change and the water's different underneath you, and times have changed a lot. There's one thing we tried to do, and Sandy down here might remember more, but I realised we had thousands of Commonwealth scholars around the world who we weren't capitalising on that sort of goodwill towards the Commonwealth. And I think we made some start to try and sort of harness that energy. In fact, my younger brother was a Commonwealth scholar, and it meant nothing at all to him. Well, it meant a check once a month when he took his, I don't know where he went, Bailey or somewhere. But, you know, the Commonwealth meant nothing to him in terms of that scholarship. It was the fact that it enabled him to be there. And so we didn't really make enough of our alumni for those purposes. In which case, if, like so many other Commonwealth organisations that we have, all 86 or 87, you know, to me, a Commonwealth alumni of scholarship, you know, it could be harnessed to channel energy into the very thing you're talking about, because they've had that experience. Otherwise, we're limited to the ones who are telling us what happened today, not what happened 15 years, 20 years ago.
Just the thinking out loud. I've seen a lot about how our DFID budget has been spent around the world, and it seems to me to be an entirely legitimate use of that very large budget. If a lot more of it was given to the kind of educational projects and scholarships and which are associated with the Commonwealth. I mean, that figure you quoted of £1 to the Commonwealth for every £350 to Europe or £50 to the UN is a pretty meagre sum, and the money is available, and I would have thought the Commonwealth counted within that DFID development budget. So I wonder whether people shouldn't start, I was only thinking aloud here, shouldn't start wondering about this kind of idea.
One way, I mean, I can add to that, because one of the things where we did develop the right relationships, despite what our budget was, whatever it was, I forget now, we did escalate that by going to DFID and saying, hey, we got a really good project here, we got no money. And DFID could sometimes pay. We could do it, we could go to the EU and get money from the EU, we go to the World Bank, get money from them, we go to the IMF. So we used to, the whole project I ran in Swaziland was run by UNDP money. We had no budget for that at all, apart from, I suppose, our own staff down there. But the whole program underneath of rewriting a constitution was very willingly played by UNDP. And that's where, like organisations, can actually work together very well. And the importance for us as a I still talk about us, obviously, Commonwealth, even though I've been removed for some time, but the good thing is that you're actually all trying to achieve the same thing. Between the EU, UNDP, the bank, the fund, you're all trying to do things better in countries, for better governance, for better standards of living and such things like that. And if you're working together, it's so much better. So if the Commonwealth concentrates on some areas, then we can allow UNDP to do something that we just don't have money for.
Question.
William Horsley, I'm a former BBC journalist. I'm working a lot at the moment with UN and UNESCO on rule of law and freedom of media issues. Actually, as an aside, I just thought on the aid point, it's a fact that a lot of the UK's aid, and the UK is one of the top 4 or 5 aid givers in the world, goes through the EU and through the UN. So I think perhaps that should be taken into account in terms of the flow of money going from the UK to Commonwealth countries. But my question is about the Commonwealth and the rule of law and the judicial standards, because I heard your lively debate this morning on the Start the Week programme, which was excellent, and I took some heart from the thought that the common law traditions and all that have made the Commonwealth countries on the whole less corrupt and less authoritarian than the Francophonie countries, for example. That would be nice if it was the case. But the evidence that I'm seeing from the UN and UNESCO is that in terms of issues like impunity, the failure to correct gross human rights abuses, in the context of Sri Lanka, but also in the area that I'm concerned with, the ability of journalists to work without fear and without attack and murder. Actually, India and Pakistan are two of the villains of the peace. They have openly opposed and almost derailed a significant UN program to put in place a plan of action, an international plan of action to crack down on this through various means, UN agencies and national governments and so on. So the fact that at least 3 Commonwealth countries, Pakistan, India and Sri Lanka, are in the top dozen or so of the lists of countries that tolerate impunity, that are responsible for impunity in that area, but also vis-à-vis human rights defenders and others. Perhaps you might like to comment on to what extent that trend is concerning you, and perhaps particularly in the context of the Chogam coming up in Sri Lanka, where that was one of the most gross examples of human rights abuses in which journalists too were targeted. The figures are immense. The numbers of journalists missing or killed, and no single case of the justice system working. Does that not concern you? What do you think about
it's
look,
the Commonwealth's success in any of these areas is based on just relentless pressure all the time to keep it up. Now, I think I made a comment this morning that my more recent involvement in the Maldives is all about trying to develop slightly more maturity in their democratic institution. But they've only been a democracy for 4 years. And what I'm seeing there is, when those people have lived under the 30-year dictatorship of old President Gayoom and other dictators before them, how do you expect these people to suddenly become pure democrats overnight and accept that decisions in a democracy tend to be widespread? They are made by judges, or they're made by ministers, or they can be made by legislature. Instead, what we're seeing now is this very new democracy in the Maldives. Everyone's trying to push the other person off the block. It's going to take some time, and that's only a very small country. So we do tend to expect a lot from countries that are still struggling with institutions that in their terms are only a few decades old. We can certainly espouse the values, we can stress the need that this is the best way it's done, but it does take a long time. One area where I felt very proud of various Commonwealth leaders, is when you have one of those very difficult issues where the domestic politics of one leader is putting enormous pressure on him not to do something. And to suddenly see that leader rise above it and say, well, I'm putting domestic politics aside, I'm going to go with the consensus of the Commonwealth. That's pretty courageous, because you know very well that leader's going to get beaten up verbally or somewhere, when they get back home for not taking into account domestic politics. But when domestic politics is below the level of Commonwealth expectations and values, you're expecting leaders like that to emerge more often than probably what they do. But they do, and that's a good thing to see. So yes, we can have high expectations of what will happen, and then suddenly they'll let you down. I mean, I thought that Kenya was heading for a reasonable election in 06, and then suddenly, 07 was it? Suddenly it all just went to hell, and it shouldn't have happened. And I kicked myself that I didn't spend more time with Kibaki convincing him you've just got to put far more effort into rejigging things like that electoral commission. But these issues never rest. They require attention constantly. And I would still say that the authority that the Secretary General has is pretty considerable. And at times that I could remember when I could privately say to a political leader, your fellow Commonwealth leaders think you should probably be on the CMAG agenda. And that would really pull them up short. Really pull them up short. And they realise that, and you would see change. And this is where I say these were the train wrecks that didn't occur. When you suddenly see they'll move away from the course that they were on. And that to me was a good thing, because they realised that that power of being on CMAG, the Ministerial Action Group, was something they didn't really want and did tend to avoid.
Thank you. Conscious of the fact that we have a reception set out in the dressing room that's much warmer than here, I think I'll allow one more question from my colleague Cody.
Thank you. Coyote Samuel. I just want to ask a question that probably doesn't fall within your tenure, but which is something that happened while you were foreign minister, and that has to do with Abacha. I've not bought the book, by the way, I intend to pick up a copy. In what ways would you say that the experience with Abacha helped in preparing you to take on the Commonwealth Secretary Generalship? Then the second one is, you just spoke about a situation where domestic politics could be at variance with Commonwealth ideals. The execution of Ken Sarunwa in 1995 clearly was such an example. I wonder whether there have been several more instances that you have encountered in your position as Commonwealth Secretary General, and what kind of impact would you say? What I'm trying to say is that were there instances when the Commonwealth had to back down and waver ideals because of a strong leader who disagreed with what you might consider to be the Commonwealth idea?
Yeah, well, a couple of good points there. Dealing with Sonny Abacha, it was just an incredible period there where I can only say I just think all the stars happened to be aligned at the right time. The fact that Chogan was meeting in Auckland, the fact that Abacha, despite protestations from the world community, do not do what you say you're going to do, the fact that Mandela was at the Chogan and prepared to come down very heavily on a fellow African leader, all those things just came together. I'm almost prepared to say, had Abacha executed those people 2 weeks later, it would have been quite different, a quite different response from the Commonwealth. But having them all together there in New Zealand, they just, bang, it occurred. And I think the legacy of it was for the benefit of the Commonwealth tremendously. The whole CMAG process, the lot came out of it. So when I first went to Nigeria for the first CMAG meeting we had there, you know, I realized that this was a huge issue to deal with, and it wasn't going to be solved overnight. The strength of the Nigerian leadership, not only in the quality of the people, but their backgrounds, their education, was formidable. And it shook me that these people were defending Abacha to the very end. You realise then this ain't no cakewalk. And but you also realise that if this is going to be changed, you've got to persevere, and you've just got to hang in there. And that's what the Commonwealth did, despite the protestations from Nigeria. Supported, I got to say, from Ghana. You know, Nigeria is very important. We've got to back off. We shouldn't push them very hard. And this was CMAG in its very early days, finding its feet on an extraordinarily difficult issue. I think they came out of it okay. But as we find out later, no two CMAG issues are the same. the issues are different, the players are different, the neighbouring countries are different, and everything sort of moves in a different way. As to leaders, where there's been a head-to-head, and I can't. There probably is one or two. I can't think of it. But look, invariably in these circumstances, you end up by agreeing to disagree. Well, I think one of my last arguments with President Museveni was a bit on that one, that he had done, before the Shogun we had in Uganda, he had, under a fair amount of encouragement, he had made some changes that we felt were pretty important. I think there was one he just wouldn't move on, and was it something that we should break the relationship on? No. It was serious, but so you end up by agreeing to disagree rather than have a you won, I lost situation.
Okay, we're going to move to the informal part of our proceedings. I know people will still have questions, but you can put them to Don over a drink. I hope you'll join us. On the way, you'll see copies of the book for sale. I do urge you to buy one. It's great. But before we go, thank Don and Peter for such entertaining and thought-provoking presentations. Thank you so much for coming.